Well, good morning to you. We're glad that you're with us this morning for our Bible class. Boy, it got quiet fast. I feel powerful all of a sudden. That was great. We're glad that you joined us, and Happy New Year and all of that. It's 2021, and make sure you look on your check. Make sure you wrote 2021, not 2020. So we are involved in a study, as you see on the screens, of a biblical study of addictions and social media. As we said, the first few weeks, this is sort of a two-part class. We're in the section of the class still that deals with addiction. And it looks like, I was looking over my notes this week a little bit, it looks like we'll be involved in that part of the study, not just this Sunday, probably two more. It looks like probably about the third Sunday of January we'll finish this part of the study. And then the remainder, there's 5 Sundays in January. So the last 2 Sundays of January and then the 4 Sundays in February probably spend on social media. If we need to move that down one more week, that's okay. As we've said, some of the things on social media will be not necessarily review, but kind of reusing some of the same materials, some of the same concepts, a better way of putting that. As we're spending the bulk of our time in this study of addictions, we're using the list from 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16 that Scripture is given to us for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, and for instruction in righteousness as kind of the broad umbrellas, that's the best term I can think of the categories we're thinking about as we think about addictions. And I didn't say this last week. I'm trying not to introduce the class the same way every week. I'm trying to mention some of the same things from time to time just to make sure our minds are all going the same way. One of the reasons we're doing that is for the reason that you will not find the words addict, addiction in the Bible. And so we have to take concepts more than, hey, let's turn to a concordance, find the word addiction, read those 17 verses, and then we have our study. Well, the word's not there. But there are concepts all throughout the Bible. And we're trying to kind of categorize, or as we said, kind of put under umbrellas some of those concepts under these 3 things. And this week we're going into the third of those, and that is the concept of correction as it pertains to addiction. In 2 Timothy 3:16, the word you'll find as correction is a word, as you see on the screens, I hope, that literally means to a straightening up. And that's a weird definition, but I've never tried to write a dictionary, so I'll give a pass on that one. But the key to it really is that concept of being straight or straightening up, that kind of concept. And so when Paul used that word in 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, what he basically meant, this is more interpretation than it is definition, but what he basically meant is the Scriptures are there to help us lead a straight life or a straight path. That's the concept here. Is that it's a life that is following, if I may use another New Testament concept, it's a life that's following the way, a straight way, a straight path. And so when we think about correction, that's really what we're thinking about, is helping people, or the addict helping himself or herself to lead a life that is straight toward the way that God would have that person to live. Now, by using the word correction, or by translating that word as correction, obviously some of that is going to involve some very difficult steps. And so not all of this is just, hug and love and all of that. That's some of it. But one reason it's translated with a word that may seem a little bit strong or maybe even negative, correction, is because some of this is takes, I should say, some negative things or some difficult things, probably a better way of saying that. But it's all hopefully done with the goal of, I want to help someone move towards a life that is straight toward God. Or if I am the addict, I want to live a life that is straight toward God. And so what are some steps, what are some things that I need to think and do in order to live that kind of life? I want to start, and I got this list, I adapted this list, a better way of putting it, from a book about dealing with addiction, where a writer kind of summarized some common ways that people think they need to do this, but that really are not necessarily the proper way of doing it. And the book that I'm referencing was actually one that dealt more with alcohol and well, really alcohol addiction. It mentioned drugs a little bit, but mostly alcohol addiction. But the writer of the book said there are some things people just say or they try to do, and he kind of said they're the wrong things to do. That may be too strong of a word, but he gave some that were very interesting to me. He listed four. There's a couple on the screens. There's a couple of screens of these. One, he said, is we don't need to use trite statements that sound biblical. And when I first read that sentence, I was like, what in the world is he talking about? And then thankfully he gave an example. The example he gave was, God helps those who help themselves. Where is that in the Bible? That verse is not there. Now, is the concept there? Well, to some degree, yes. We must desire God's help, God's mercy, God's grace. But if that's all we say to someone who is addicted, then we've really put the emphasis on them. This is all on you. God won't help you unless you help yourself. Well, there may be some concept to that that's remotely true. But that can't be all we say. And I really appreciate the writer of that book saying this really in a lot of ways is a trite statement because it's one basically everyone in the room finished the sentence for me. We've all heard it. We probably all said it at some point. But it's kind of cliche, and it's at best partially true. Or maybe, to use kind of fancy words, at best kind of tangentially true. Yes, we desire God's help. But it's almost as if we cut God out of the deal, as if He's just standing off, not even caring until we make the first step. Well, God is always willing to help. And yes, we have a part to play in it. But we can't just throw that one statement out there and say, well, that's all I've got to say to that person. Now it's completely up to them. Well, no, I can help too. God will help too. Others can help too. It's not a one-person role here in order to do that. A second thing he mentioned was to think that one conversation will solve the issue. If I can get this as a preacher, if I can get this person in my office, and have one counseling session or one great conversation or say just the one right sentence, that's going to solve that person's problem. I never really have to deal with them again because I've given them exactly what they needed to hear. I've said it in just the right way, and that's going to solve everything. Someone who is addicted, this is going to be a long, long, long process. And quite often we might find ourselves not only talking to the person more than once, we might find ourselves saying some of the same things over and over and over again. And that's okay to a point. Yes, we want to see progress, but even if we're not addicted to something, if we are just simply struggling with something, how often is it one conversation that completely turns our life around? Well, not very often. It may turn us in the right direction, but very often we still need counseling or conversation or wisdom to help us with certain aspects of that. So we can't just sort of have, one conversation or one counseling session and say, well, I can wash my hands of this. I've done my job. I've said everything I know. I said everything I know to say. We need to realize this is going to take a lot of patience, a lot of conversation, a lot of counseling, whatever word we want to use there. A third thing this person mentioned, that we need to think we know when someone has hit rock bottom. This is a very common mistake. Is I'm seeing someone go through this addiction. I'm seeing someone take this step and this step and this step. But if I try to help them now, they probably won't want it because they haven't hit rock bottom yet. And connected with, I'm going to combine these two as well, is believing we have to wait until they hit that in order to help. Here's why that writer said that. How do we know where rock bottom is for that person? It's a moving target. It's different for every person. For one person, rock bottom might be they lost their job. That might be rock bottom. For somebody else, that might be step 5 out of 50. And they are nowhere near where the bottom could be for them. So if I'm waiting for someone to hit their lowest point, or again to use that kind of common phrase, rock bottom, I can't know where that is for that person. And of course the point the writer of that book was trying to make is, I need to try to help all along the way. That person may never actually hit what could have been rock bottom. That's possible too. Or I could be waiting for, well, this was rock bottom for that person. I'll wait till this other person hits that, how do I know that's their lowest point? Or how do I know their lowest point isn't actually even possibly worse than that? And so these are some things that, they're not from the Bible, but some concepts there. And really the main concept is we're willing to help all along the way. But they're things that we just kind of throw around when we're trying to, and these are huge situations. Let me say that. We're not dealing with easy stuff here. But we kind of throw around these ideas regularly when in reality, sometimes we're giving just very simplistic answers or solutions to something that's far more complex. And we need to be willing to help all along the way. So those are kind of some negatives. And I didn't want to end with that for sure. For one thing, we've got a lot of time left. But also, I'd like to go more positive. What are some steps that we can take? What are some things we can do to try to help someone who is an addict? These are all, some will have verses, some won't, but they are all biblical concepts. First of all, I need to help them spend time in the Word. And really what I put in parentheses may be a better way of wording this, or the concept to think about. And that is that I need to help someone see things as God sees them. Sometimes that's, in a lot of ways, what an addict is suffering with the most, or at least as strongly as anything else, is that they're not seeing things, not just from reality, quote unquote, but in a lot of ways, someone who is a Christian, who may be suffering from an addiction, is no longer really seeing things the way God sees them. They've moved enough away from that worldview, that viewpoint, that they may know they're quote-unquote sick or hurting or something else, but they don't really see, to use the definition of the word correction, they don't really see the path that God has laid out anymore. And so I need to encourage that person to spend time in the Word of God, to find helpful passages, to study with them, not just so they can memorize verses, that's wonderful, but also so they get their view of the world back in the right way. How does God view, and by the way, not just how does God view this particular sin or this particular addiction, but how does God view everything surrounding it? How does God view, if I'm an addict, and it's hurting my marriage, I need to be reminded of how God views marriage. How is this hurting my relationship with my wife, with my husband? And how would God have me to heal that and to help that? So it's not just that particular temptation or sin, it's everything connected with it. I need to make sure that I'm seeing not just from a good standpoint or a helpful standpoint, but from God's standpoint. And the other part of this that helps us, if we're trying to help someone who is an addict, we make sure they're in God's Word, is it keeps me as the one helping from thinking I'm the authority figure. God is the authority figure. I'm a helper. And those two things cannot be mixed up. Now, that other person may look at me as an authority, and that's okay to a certain extent. But if I'm constantly pointing them to God's Word, here's how God views this. Here's how God can help with this. Here's how God wants you to live connected with this. Then it's no longer, my opinion or how I feel about things. It is God who is in His rightful place as the authority figure for that person. And I'm constantly pointing that person not to me, but to Him. And so we need to help those people, spend time in the Word of God for help, but also, again, to use that word for authority. So they'll see things as God would have them to see it. Second, and I forgot to tell you, there's going to be, I think, 7 of these on this list. Second is we need to renew the mind first. We've mentioned this before just a little bit, and part of this is very difficult because we see the person doing something. We see them, wasting all their money on whatever they're addicted to. We see them harming their marriage, and they're being abusive to a spouse. We see the action, and yes, those actions need to stop. There's no doubt about that. We're not saying that at all. That those actions need to stop. But over and over and over and over in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, the Bible consistently speaks to how change starts from within, with our minds, with our thinking, and how we desire to live our lives. Ephesians 4, verses 23 and 24 contains that phrase, to be renewed in the spirit of your mind. And then the next verse Verse 24 is the one that talks about putting on the new self. Verse 23 talks about renewing the mind. And then when I've renewed my mind, then I'm ready to put on that new self. It starts, though, with the way that I think. Romans 12, 1 and 2 is a passage about making sure that our minds are in the right place. I just realized I was in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. It's not going to help very much. Romans chapter 12, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship or spiritual service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the things that you do. It's not what the verse says, is it? Be transformed by the renewing or the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. I didn't put the references on the screens because it would have taken up the whole screen, basically. But how many times in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus spoke to those specific sins, did he first talk about the attitude or the heart out of which the action comes? For example, did he say adultery is wrong? Yes. Yes, but where does it start? Whoever looks at a woman with lustful intent. In other words, whoever's mind is thinking about those kinds of things has already committed the act. It starts in thinking. He talks the same thing about murder. It begins with hatred. And that whole section of the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard it said, but I say to you, basically that entire section is Jesus saying, get your mind, get your heart, get your thinking right, and the actions will take care of themselves. It's a concept found throughout the Bible over and over and over again. We could have all kinds of examples of these. Here are a couple that I thought of. Someone maybe who's an addict to alcohol. Yes, taking away their alcohol is important for them. That's an important step. But if all they do is stop doing the action, but they still wish they were doing it, well, they need to renew their mind. They need to see what God actually has to say about drunkenness and about our thinking. I mentioned something connected with this one just a second ago. Someone who's addicted to pornography needs to filter their internet, or maybe I'm going to have internet. I know that's dangerous stuff right there to not have it. And that's great. That's an important first step. But that's not teaching them everything the Bible says about making sure that their heart is pure, that they're not still lusting, and they're not actually looking at particular images or websites or whatever it happens to be. The same be true as someone who's a gambling addict. A lot of people are addicted to online gambling. It's great for them to have their internet filtered so they don't go to those sites, but they're still really wishing they could. We need to help them think about contentment and other related biblical issues so their mind is renewed, not just their actions are going the right direction. Step 3, or another step, this isn't necessarily a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order, but a third thing we can do is to call something what it actually is. We live in a world that wants to euphemize basically everything because we don't want it to sound as bad or as negative as it actually is. For example, we in our culture really like to talk about problem drinking. What's the Bible call it? Drunkenness. We need to call it what the Bible calls it. Yes, someone has a problem drinking. There's no doubt about that. But if we continually use these things that sound just a little bit less than, someone who really has an addiction problem may see it as less than instead of what it actually is. I'll even say, if we constantly just use the phrase internet porn instead of calling it pornography, that sounds lesser. Because our culture has so accepted that internet porn sounds almost like a fun, cool, cute way of describing it, when it very much isn't. What about someone who's addicted to workaholism? They're just overworking. They just work too hard. But we can be addicted to work. And we need to make sure we call it what it is. And we could go on and on with these things that, and I'm not saying we can never use the other ones. I mean, it'd be kind of, boring world if we have one thing to say, you use the same word 10,000 times in a row. But at some point, if we're trying to help someone who is addicted to something, we need to call it what it is. The Bible calls things exactly what they are over and over again. And if God is willing to do that, then if we're trying to help someone We need to actually say, you are struggling with fill in the blank, not some lesser version of that makes it seem like, well, yeah, I got a little bit of a problem, but it's not that big of a deal. When we've used terminology that might actually feed into that thinking, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Number 4, we won't spend time on. Oh, it's already on there. We won't spend time on this one because we spent a week and a half of our class on it, and that is to help someone make the connection between the specific sin and idolatry. If you weren't here for those lessons, I believe that was weeks 2 and 3 or 3 and 4. Just watch all of them online up to this one. You'll catch up. We made the connection between what the Bible says about idolatry and how that's anything that comes before God. And if I am addicted to something, I'm putting that thing, at least in some form or fashion, ahead of God. And we need to help people make that connection. This is not just I have a problem with X, Y, or Z, but I'm putting that thing, whatever it is, or that activity, ahead of God. We need to help them make that connection. Number 5 is kind of a 2-part thing. We need to be willing to talk about 2 concepts that are absolutely forgotten in our culture, at least the culture at large. First is we need to be able to use the word sin. Our culture basically only uses that word in a playful way. It's become a fun word. It's become one of those things that just isn't any big deal. But if we're trying to help someone, we need to recapture that word and talk about how these addictions not just are a problem for a marriage or a problem for finances or a problem for health, but they are a sin. There's something that's an affront to God, an affront to a holy God. And it's something that places a wedge between myself and God, not just between myself and my health or myself and my spouse or myself and my kids. That stuff's important. I'm not trying to downplay that at all. But we have to be willing to call these things what they are, and the Bible calls them sin. And we have to recapture that word and be willing to use that word and be able to say, look, this is dangerous, yes, but it's also wrong. It's sinful, and it will keep someone out of heaven. And the other concept we have to make sure we talk about is personal choice, or if you're taking notes, you choose the word accountability. I'm not going to get into this class because, frankly, I'm not smart enough. I've done some study on it, but I'm not smart enough to solve all the issues and all the medical or psychological sides of it and everything. Can people be predisposed to particular addictions? It seems as if some are to some degree, but I don't know. I don't know that for every single possible addiction we can think of. But here's the thing. Even if someone has some kind of medical or psychological or mental, whatever the right terminology is, predisposition for something, or even if someone is pressured by a family, by a dear friend, by people at school, by someone they work with, whatever, even if someone is culturally disadvantaged, in other words, they grew up in a neighborhood where this particular addiction just ran rampant. They grew up in the middle of a neighborhood where drug addiction was on every corner. You couldn't miss it no matter how you left your neighborhood. You couldn't miss it. You still choose to be involved in it. All those other things may be true. And our heart should break for people who have trouble not just seeing these things around them constantly, but someone still makes the choice to be involved in whatever it is they're involved in, whether it's drugs or overworking or sex addiction or whatever. They still have made that choice. I remember when I've taken 2 short-term mission trips to Scotland. And I remember on the second of those trips, there was a girl, I imagine she was probably about 14, 15, somewhere right in there. I know she wasn't old enough to drive because our missionary group would pick her up each morning and drive her home each afternoon. So she couldn't drive to the work days, but she came every day. She had been baptized, and she came every day, helped us with different things. Beautiful girl, but there was something you could tell that just wasn't right. She was kind of, if I may use the word, kind of clingy, even with the boys. She wasn't necessarily flirtatious, but just she got right by the guys. I was married. I was really uncomfortable with this girl being that close to me because, one, I'm not that good looking, but also I was married, and one day it was our group, Leah and myself and 3 or 4 others who were on that particular bus, whose route it was to take her home. And when we got to her house and she got off the bus, And I looked over where she lives. It's an apartment building. I would guess probably 10 or 12 apartments in this one particular building. There were at least 2 prostitutes, no doubt about it, what they were doing by the front door. There were at least 2 or 3 people either using or selling drugs right there, right outside the church bus, right by her door. And my thought was, what kind of chance does this girl have? It's no wonder she kind of acts this way, kind of clingy. It's what she sees. But then I also thought, she's made a choice to leave that every morning and to ride an old stinky church bus to come help some Americans she's only going to see for 10 or 12 days and will never see again as long as she lives, probably. And to walk right by that every day to do that. And I wondered if some of the clinginess and everything else wasn't because she may have taken drugs at one point in her past. I don't know that. There's no way for me to know that. But she was making a choice every day to move right past those things that were literally at her doorstep to do what was right. Yes, someone may have, again, yes as in it's possible. Some may have like a predisposition. Some may be, culturally disadvantaged or may be pressured by even family, but by people close to them. But it's still someone's choice, and we have to recapture the idea to help people of personal accountability. This was your choice, but it can also be your choice to work out of it with God's help and the help of other people. We have to have that concept. If someone's going to be helped, we have to make sure that we sympathize with them, but that we don't give them an out to blame this or that or the other thing, but to say, I have chosen this, but I'm also choosing to work through this with God's help and your help or other people's help. A 6th thing is do not enable. And I put the second sentence may seem very much like the first, but it need to be said. Enabling is not helping. If someone struggles with gambling, they don't need to have access to the debit cards or credit cards, no matter where they're going or what they're doing. Because, I'll trust them on this particular trip. You just enabled that person to go right back into those things that they're struggling to get out of or work through. I read a story, you may have seen that, it kind of made the rounds in a lot of books for some reason. I've come across the same story about 3 or 4 times. I've seen it online as well. About a man who struggled with internet pornography. And he confessed that to his wife. I want to say he was probably in his mid-40s, something like that. Confessed that to his wife. He was a businessman. He traveled all over the country constantly for business. But he confessed it to his wife. She forgave him. They agreed to work through it. They had a million filters on their internet at home and everything else. But he still thought, I'm going to hotels all over the country. And this is back in the time where on the television you could choose the movies, and some of those movies were pornographic. Now you don't have to do that because there's Wi-Fi in the rooms, and seriously, the hotels were losing money offering those movies because people were just watching them on their online on their computers for free. But when he would check into a hotel, or actually before he would check into a hotel, he would call and make his reservation, and he would say, whatever room you assign to me, that's fine. I don't care. I just need one bed or whatever he asked for. But he said, I have one special request. Please have your maintenance people have taken the television out before I check into my room. And they would say, sir, we can't do that. And he would tell them that I'm staying in a different hotel. Because all you got to do is unplug it and pull it out. And he was a person who realized that if I was in front of that, I'm enabling myself, because that's something I struggle with. But if I'm trying to help someone, I need to say, just this one time, I cannot enable someone, because enabling is not helping. And it's hard. That's a hard line. We've all probably struggled with that in different areas. It's a hard line to follow, but it's something we have to do as best we can. And then the 7th thing you see on the screens is we can't help someone replace one sin with another sin. It may seem obvious, but it needs to be said. If someone has what a lot of people like to call an addictive personality, sometimes we try to help them replace what they were doing with something else that's basically just as addictive. And the classic example is people who give up smoking and they become overeaters. That happens constantly. And some of that's just because they're so used to doing something with their hands that comes to their mouth that they become over. And we sometimes enable that. Well, you're eating, you're not smoking. You're eating way more than you should. You're unhealthy. Well, that's not good either. We can't help someone overcome one thing by giving them something else that might be addictive as well. Instead, we need to help them overcome with things that are good and right and helpful. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 5. I know it's just a little bit out of context, but the concept is helpful. Paul said, we destroy arguments and lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. That's one of my favorite concepts in the whole New Testament. We take every thought captive. And one reason that's one of my favorite concepts is because he doesn't say we take every action captive. That's going to happen. We take every thought captive. But if I'm struggling with something, I've been addicted to something, and that feeling, that psychological feeling, whatever it is, begins to come to my mind, that's not necessarily sinful. So long as I take that thought and give it over to Jesus and replace it with something wholesome and biblical and healthy. And don't dwell on it to the point where now I'm feeling like I need to go be involved in whatever it was again. Addicts, people who truly are overcoming addiction, they are going to struggle with their thought life probably the rest of their life. Maybe not, but probably. But just because at some point, 10, 12, 15 years down the road, they have a passing thought. I used to be a drug addict, and I have some feeling. I happen to drive by somewhere, and it just brings something to my mind. I have that feeling. That's not wrong, so long as I take it captive. And I ask God to help me through that moment. And I thank God for helping me through it earlier. And I move on and do things the way He would have me to do it. We take every thought captive. Now, those things were more for the person who's trying to help. In the, 10 or 11 minutes we've got left, and these will be a little bit shorter probably, I want us to think about if someone is an addict. And these will also be if you're helping someone. These will be some things that are helpful too, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if either in the rooms or online, especially online, maybe even later, someone just stumbles across this and they think, well, that's great, but I'm the one in the middle of this. I'm the one trying to overcome an alcohol addiction or a pornography addiction or whatever. What are some steps I can take? And I hope, again, all of these, you see some verses on the screens, but all of these have biblical concepts behind them. Number one is to have a Philippians 4:8 think list. And you go, that's the weirdest sentence I've ever seen in the English language. I'm not sure those words have ever been put together to form a sentence. Well, what's Philippians 4:8? Philippians 4:8 is that verse where Paul tells us exactly what to think about. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And I'm told that the word think there literally means to dwell on these things. In other words, don't just let it be a passing thought, but let these kinds of things be the things that fill our thinking. If you are an addict, when tempting thoughts come into your mind, and they will, or when you realize I might be around something or around someone because of my work or because of school or something that might trigger some of those thoughts, have in your mind, here's what I'm going to think about if that happens. If I'm married, I'm going to think about my spouse. If I'm not married, I'm going to think about a Bible verse that's really been helpful to me. Or I'm going to think about a song that really helps me get through something. I'm going to think about how God has forgiven me. I'm going to think about those good and lovely and just things. And have that built in your mind constantly. By the way, this isn't bad for any of us, much less for an addict. But it's especially true for someone who is really going to struggle with their thought life about something specific, probably for the rest of their life. Connected with that, number two, is to change a negative thought into a positive thought. Here's what I mean by that. You may have someone who's really trying to help you, and you don't really like the way they're trying to help you. This is just an example. Maybe you have struggled with something, and someone you barely know from church has come up and They think they're doing the first list. They're really not. They're using one of those trite statements, or they're saying something and it really is not that helpful, and maybe even kind of leads you to think, not necessarily sinful things, but kind of have some resentment toward that person or something like that. How can I possibly change that kind of negative feeling, that negative thinking, into something positive? I remember that love bears all things and believes all things. I guess that person's doing the best they can. They're not a trained counselor. They're not trained in these sorts of things, but they're trying to help. And I may still be sort of frustrated with the counsel, or maybe it's non-counsel, that they're giving to me. But I remember that they're trying to help. They're trying to think the best of me. They're trying to see that there is good in my life. And I'm going to bear with that. I don't believe they're trying to do the best as well. That's just one example. We could go basically infinite with this, but there are all kinds of biblical concepts where I can change something where I begin to have a negative, a frustrated feeling, and realize there's all kinds of good things that are there as well. Number 3 is to change any conversation that turns ungodly. On the screens, I referenced Ephesians chapter 5, and verse 4. I think this is the one I want to read more than what was there. Make sure. Yeah. I wanted to read verses 4 through 6, really. Ephesians 5, beginning of verse 4. Let there be no filthiness, or foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving. For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure, or who is covetous, that is an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you with empty words. For because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. I wanted to read through verse 6. It talks about what we listen to as well. Don't let people deceive you. But notice verse 4. Don't let anything, negative, filthiness, foolish talk, crude joking, don't let those things come out of our mouth, but instead make sure we say things that are filled with thanksgiving, to use Paul's word. In my notes, what I put was, if God isn't in the conversation, get out of the conversation. I think that's not a bad way to handle these types of things. If there's a conversation that turns to something that's ungodly, not even necessarily that's connected with my addiction, but if I'm around things that are ungodly, it's going to begin to draw my mind towards that thing I'm trying to fight against. And if I can't change that conversation to something that is godly, I need to get out of it. Number 4, I need to follow 1 Thessalonians 5:22. Abstain from every appearance of evil. That verse does not just say abstain from evil. It says to abstain from every appearance of evil. Anything that remotely has anything to do with what is sinful and wrong, I need to have a way to stay away from it. If I struggle with drinking, I may have to change a driving route, so I avoid going by an old hangout or a buddy's house I used to drop by and have some beers with on the weekend. I may have to change the way I drive to work. This is not because of an addiction, but as I was typing that in my notes, I thought the first time we lived in Haleyville, Alabama, we lived, to use the southern word, catty corner, from a person who was a president of the bank. Now, don't be impressed with the neighborhood we lived in. He bought the house when he was about 30 years old and was about, like junior, vice president or something. But he told me one day, he said, probably about 15, 20 years ago, one day I was at my house and got a knock on the door, and the FBI was there. And he was like, what have I done? He's a Christian man, he's doing a good job. And the guy said, we've been watching your house for about a week. So, okay, I had no idea. And he said, I was kind of freaked out. And they told him, you need to change how you go to work, because we figured it out. And if we figured it out, then somebody who wants the money in that bank probably has figured it out too. And so this man, Mom and Dad know him, Ricky, told me that for the previous however long this had been, 12, 13, 14 years or whatever, and if you've never been to Haleyville, Alabama, for one thing, you're in the majority. But also, there's only so many ways to drive places. It's a very tiny town. But he told me he had never taken the same route at the same time 2 days in a row in all of that time. And when I was typing these notes, I thought, I thought of him not because of the addiction thing, but I thought that might be what someone who's addicted to something has to do. They so completely change because I don't want to drive by that hangout anymore. I don't want to drive by that person's house anymore. Simply because it might trigger thinking, or I might one day say, yeah, it'd be nice to drop in and see old. No, it wouldn't be. Because that could lead to me falling right back into those things. If I struggle with overspending, I might have to block Amazon. I know that's tough stuff, and eBay and Etsy, and but I might have to if I'm literally addicted to shopping, which some people are. I might have to block certain things. Let me get through this list. We got about 5 minutes left. Number 5 is to have a prepared answer for tempting situations. Be prepared ahead of time. What is it that I could say if I am struggling with an alcohol addiction and somebody says, oh, come on, it's just one drink. If I don't have an answer ready, I'm probably not going to have an answer. And my prepared answer might be silly to the other person. It might seem dumb to everybody else. But it shows I have thought about this and realized I am going to struggle with this, and here's my answer. As foolish as it might sound, or as dumb as it might sound to somebody else, or I might get laughed at, or they might, whatever they might say, I already have an answer, so I have an answer. Instead of being caught not having one. For someone who's struggling to overcome an addiction, by the way, having a prepared answer, using it, and walking away is a huge moment. A huge moment. Nobody else in that room, nobody else in that conversation may realize how big of a moment that is. But it's massive. Because it shows they have thought ahead of time that I'm going to struggle with this, but I'm going to be prepared for when those times come. And they're going to, more than likely. And then number 6, as you already see, is to realize times when you might be most tempted, or circumstances. Someone one time listed, that the times where you're most likely not just to fall into addiction, but they actually said to fall into basically any sin, is when we're tired, bored, stressed, angry, or even hungry. And I thought that's actually a pretty good list, because that's when my defenses are most down. When I'm not thinking clear because I'm tired or because I'm hungry, I want to eat something, right? You get all kinds of riled up, or because I'm stressed, and I give myself an out to give in to something to take the stress away. When I'm bored, how many people, I'm teaching the second part of class, how many people are addicted to social media because they're bored? And all we can think of to do is, because at least I'm doing something. That's kind of frightening. That's the world we live in. How many people are addicted to something because they're angry? I'm more likely to fall back into it because I just got mad at somebody, and just to show them something, I went ahead and took that drink again, or I went ahead, whatever it is. But I thought that was a pretty good list. But for everybody, it's going to be different. It might not be any of those things. It might be, as we already said, a certain place that I just cannot go anymore, or a certain person I just cannot be around anymore, especially in person. But I realize if I go to this place, or if I have these feelings, or if I am tired, or whatever it is, I'm more likely to be tempted. So I need to, well, how can you avoid being tired? Well, okay, but I need to realize that if I am, I'm going to be more tempted. So I better put bigger guards up in those times when I'm tired or stressed or whatever it happens to be. Someone said basically that when our regular routine is upset, we can be very likely to feed our flesh instead of feeding our spiritual being. I think it's a pretty good way of putting it. When things just aren't normal, a lot of times that's when we begin to fall into addiction. I mentioned, I think it was the first week, one of the first 2 weeks, about how one of the spikes in internet pornography use is on Sundays in NFL cities when a team loses. That's actually been shown. Do you know what the number one day of the year is for internet pornography use? Thanksgiving. Why? Because people are actually at home out of their regular routine. They have time on their hands. They're out of routine. They're stressed because everybody's there together and I can get away in this bedroom or this basement or whatever it is. And it is by far the number one day of the year. And it's because of this very concept. We're out of our normal routine. We're stressed a little bit or we're tired a little bit, and that's our out. If that doesn't prove that this concept is real, I'm not sure what would. By the way, the number one day of the week is Sunday. It's Sunday because people are home and because their teams lose and things aren't normal, and so they go to that as a stress relief, as a way to kill some time, whatever it happens to be. All right, next week we're going to begin with just a little bit of some supplementary material, and then we'll, as time allows, we'll go to the final of these sections, and that is the training in righteousness. Thank you all for your attention this morning.